I want you to take a second and think back to the last time you had to have a serious high-stakes interaction with human resources at your job.
Right. A really critical one.
Exactly. Like, really put yourself back in that room. Or, maybe it was on a super awkward Zoom call.
Oh, the dreaded HR Zoom call.
Yeah, the worst. Close your eyes if you have to. What did the air in the room actually feel like? Was it this warm, supportive conversation where you felt genuinely heard?
Which is rare, let's be honest.
Super rare. Did you walk away feeling like you were treated as a complex human being navigating a difficult moment? Or did it feel a bit like you were talking to a highly trained, heavily credentialed robot?
A robot that's just reading a script.
Right. A robot nodding at all the appropriate times, citing the company handbook from memory, using all the correct corporate buzzwords, but somehow making you feel completely invisible in the process.
Yeah.
If you're leaning toward the robot comparison, you're definitely not alone in that feeling.
No, not at all. It's an incredibly common, almost universal experience in the modern corporate landscape.
Yeah.
But what's truly fascinating, though, is that this coldness, it's not just an accident.
Right.
It's not a case of a few bad apples who just happen to work in HR departments. It's actually a deeply entrenched systemic issue that is fundamentally altering how organizations function from the ground up.
Wow.
It dictates how employees feel about their workplaces, and ultimately it decides whether companies survive or completely implode during the most critical moments of stress.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because that disconnect, that gap between what HR is supposed to be and what it actually feels like on the ground, that is the entire focus of today's deep dive.
It's a massive issue.
It really is. We're exploring a huge shift in the corporate world, and we're anchoring this on a comprehensive piece of research from Jonathan H. Westover, PhD. It's titled Experience Without Empathy: Why Technical Mastery Alone No Longer Defines HR Leadership Credibility.
Such a great paper.
It is. Our mission today is to figure out why all the certifications, all the advanced data analytics, and all the pristine employment law knowledge in the world absolutely cannot save an HR leader who lacks basic human empathy.
Right, because it just doesn't work.
Exactly. We're going to explore how this credibility gap is actively harming people and look at the exact frameworks organizations are using to try and fix it.
And we should probably ground this conversation right away by clarifying what's actually at stake here.
Yeah, please do.
Because we aren't just talking about employees wishing their HR rep was like a little more polite.
Right. It's not just about hurt feelings.
Exactly. We're talking about measurable, catastrophic organizational failure.
Wow.
When HR loses what the research calls relational credibility, you can draw a direct line to failed corporate mergers, massive spikes in employee litigation, collapsing change initiatives, and just the total erosion of psychological safety.
That's a huge domino effect.
It really is. So our goal is to dissect the anatomy of that credibility, why it breaks down so reliably, and how companies like, Microsoft, Pixar, and Starbucks have successfully rebuilt it using evidence-based practices.
Well, the author sets up this core paradox right at the beginning that feels completely counterintuitive to me.
Yeah, the credibility paradox.
Right. HR professionals today, they're far more educated, they're far more strategic, and vastly more technically proficient than at any point in corporate history.
Oh, absolutely. The bar is so high now.
It's insane. They're integrating AI into their workflows. They're running highly complex workforce analytics. They know labor law inside and out.
The certifications alone take years.
Right. And yet, despite all of this unprecedented technical mastery, employees feel more alienated by HR than ever before. There's this massive disconnect between the capability of the department and the trust of the workforce.
Yeah, and Dr. Westover terms this the credibility paradox.
Yeah.
To really grasp why this is happening, we have to tear down how we define credibility in a professional setting.
How so?
Well, the research points out that credibility is not a single trait. It's actually bifurcated into two distinct types.
Okay, two types.
First, you have technical credibility. This is the foundation.
Like the hard skills.
Exactly. It involves knowing the relevant laws, understanding how to design complex compensation packages, managing massive HR software systems. It's the hard data.
Right.
But then you have the second half of the equation, which is relational credibility.
Which I imagine is how you actually interact with the living, breathing people caught up in those systems.
That's the core of it. Relational credibility hinges on interpersonal dimensions that signal respect, fairness, and a genuine, observable concern for an employee's well-being.
Okay.
The critical insight from the research is that technical credibility merely gets you in the door.
It's table stakes.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's the baseline requirement just to hold the job. But relational credibility is what actually determines whether an employee will trust you during a crisis.
Or whether a manager will actually listen to your advice.
Exactly. It determines whether senior leadership will view you as a strategic partner rather than just an administrator.
I'm thinking about this from the perspective of an everyday employee. Like, if my parent passes away and I need bereavement leave, I don't care if the HR representative has memorized the exact page and paragraph of the employee handbook
Yeah.
regarding time off.
They usually have, but yeah, it doesn't help you in that moment.
Right. Your knowledge of the policy doesn't comfort me. If you process my paperwork flawlessly, but you speak to me like I'm just a nuisance disrupting your schedule,
Which happens a lot.
then your technical perfection means nothing to me. Your humanity is what I'm evaluating.
That exact dynamic brings us to a foundational concept in the research called organizational justice theory.
Organizational justice theory.
Yeah. If we really want to understand why relational credibility matters so much to the human brain, we have to look at the mechanisms of how human beings evaluate fairness.
How do we do that?
Organizational justice theory breaks fairness down into 3 specific pillars.
Okay, walk me through them.
The first is procedural justice. This evaluates the process itself. Were the rules applied consistently across the board?
Meaning, like, if two people in the same department show up an hour late, do they both get the same documented warning? Or does the manager's favorite employee get a free pass while the other gets written up? That's a procedural question.
Exactly. The process has to be uniform. That's pillar 1.
Got it.
The second pillar is distributive justice. This evaluates the actual outcome.
So the result.
Yes. Did the punishment fit the crime? Did the bonus adequately reflect the amount of overtime worked? It's the tangible result of the process.
Okay, so we have the process and the outcome. Those seem fairly straightforward to measure.
They are, and HR departments are generally very, very good at managing those first 2.
Sure, that's their bread and butter.
But here's the third pillar, and this is where the entire system usually falls apart. Interactional justice.
Interactional justice.
Yeah. This asks a fundamentally different question. Regardless of how consistent the process was, and regardless of what the final outcome was,
Right.
how was I treated as a human being during that experience?
Oh, wow.
Was I treated with dignity? Did I feel heard? Was the communication honest and respectful, or was it dismissive?
I want to try an analogy here for you listening because visualizing the difference between these 3 pillars is crucial.
Go for it.
Think about a referee in a high-stakes sports game.
Good one.
Procedural justice is the rule book itself. The ref has to know the rules intimately.
Right.
Distributive justice is the actual penalty that the ref hands out on the field when a rule is broken.
The actual yardage.
Exactly. But interactional justice is the referee's attitude and demeanor when delivering that penalty.
Yes.
So imagine a player commits a blatant foul. The ref throws the flag. Procedural justice is completely satisfied because a rule was objectively broken.
They followed the process.
Distributive justice is satisfied because the 10-yard penalty is exactly what the rule book demands for that specific foul.
In that scenario, the technical requirements of the referee's job are executed flawlessly.
Right. But imagine what happens if, when handing out that technically flawless penalty, the referee gets right up in the player's face, aggressively screams at them, insults their intelligence, and completely demeans them in front of a stadium of 50,000 people.
People would go crazy.
The penalty yardage is 100% correct. But because the interactional justice is 0, the player is infuriated, the fans boo the referee, and everyone instantly loses respect for the authority of the game.
Exactly.
The technical accuracy of the call does absolutely nothing to save the referee from being completely discredited.
That parallel highlights the exact psychological mechanism at play in the workplace.
Really?
Yes. Decades of studies on organizational justice theory reveal a fascinating reality. Interactional justice, that third pillar, is the single strongest predictor of an employee's trust in leadership.
More than the outcome.
Much more. It predicts their long-term organizational commitment, and perhaps most surprisingly, it predicts their willingness to accept unfavorable decisions without retaliating.
Let me make sure I'm grasping the weight of that. Are you saying that if I get a genuinely bad outcome at work, like being passed over for a promotion I really wanted to this, I might actually be okay with it, provided the interactional justice was high?
The data strongly supports that, yes.
That's wild.
Whether an employee is denied a promotion, given a poor performance review, or even terminated, researchers consistently find that how they are spoken to during that process dictates their long-term reaction far more than the actual outcome itself.
So the delivery is everything.
It really is. If they were given an adequate, transparent explanation, if they were treated with basic human dignity, and if they felt the HR leader was genuinely listening to their frustration without getting defensive, those interactional elements heavily outweigh the negative distributive outcome.
We tend to think of ourselves as these hyper-logical beings who only care about the bottom line, you know?
Right, the money, the title.
Yeah, but we're actually deeply social creatures calculating respect at every turn. Which naturally leads to a massive question for anyone listening. If treating people with dignity and respect is so measurably effective, if it literally acts as a buffer against bad news, why is there such a massive credibility gap in HR right now?
It's the million-dollar question.
Why are so many employees feeling alienated? What is breaking down in the corporate system that prevents this?
Well, Dr. Westover points to three specific, deeply systemic reasons why this gap exists.
Okay.
And it's crucial to understand that this is not usually about individual HR professionals waking up and choosing to be cold.
They aren't villains.
No, not at all. The corporate system itself is often architected to make them that way.
Okay, so what's the first reason?
The first systemic flaw is what the research calls structural role tension.
Structural role tension. This feels like the classic double agent problem.
It's an impossible tightrope. HR is fundamentally tracked between two competing mandates.
Right.
On one side, they're positioned as the employee advocate. They are tasked with championing employee engagement, mental health, well-being, building a positive culture.
The warm and fuzzy stuff.
Exactly. But on the other side, they are an agent of the organization. Their job is to protect the company from legal liability, execute cost reduction strategies, and enforce the will of senior management.
I can see how that destroys trust. Like, on Tuesday, HR is hosting an intimate seminar on bringing your authentic self to work and prioritizing your mental health.
Yes.
Then on Friday, that exact same HR team is executing a mass layoff to satisfy a quarterly earnings report.
It's jarring.
From the employee's perspective, how can they possibly trust you?
To the everyday employee, that duality looks like profound hypocrisy.
Totally.
It's incredibly difficult to build relational trust when the person asking you to open up about your workplace stress today might be the person calculating your severance package tomorrow.
Yeah, that makes it so hard.
That inherent tension makes authenticity feel dangerous for both the employee and the HR professional.
I hear that, but couldn't an HR professional just maintain a neutral stance?
What do you mean?
Like, why not just play it down the middle, be objective, and act as a neutral mediator between the company and the employee?
Because in a power dynamic, neutrality is almost always perceived as siding with the more powerful entity.
Oh, that makes sense.
If an employee comes to HR with a serious grievance against a powerful executive, and HR tries to remain perfectly, quote-unquote, neutral and bureaucratic, the employee experiences that neutrality as a betrayal.
Because they needed an ally.
Exactly. They came looking for an advocate and they found a wall. So the structural tension is unavoidable.
Right.
But the second reason for the credibility gap is what the author calls a curriculum failure.
Meaning the way we're actually educating and training HR professionals before they even get the job.
Yes. Over the last 20 years, the HR profession has fought incredibly hard to be seen as a strategic business partner rather than just the department that throws office parties and handles payroll.
They want a seat at the executive table.
Exactly. And to achieve that status, university curricula and professional development certifications have heavily over-indexed on hard data and law.
Okay.
They're teaching compensation analytics, organizational design theory, employment law, and how to manage massive HR information systems.
So they're entirely focused on building that technical credibility we talked about earlier.
Completely. But in the rush to legitimize the profession with hard data, the curriculum treats interpersonal skills, the relational credibility, as a mere afterthought.
Like it's just assumed you have them.
Yes. Empathy, active listening, conflict de-escalation, they're largely treated as soft skills. The assumption is that you just naturally have them because you're a human being, rather than recognizing them as rigorous, complex disciplines that require deliberate, ongoing cultivation.
It's like assuming someone knows how to be a highly effective trauma counselor simply because they read a textbook on human anatomy.
That's a great way to put it.
Knowing the rules of employment law does not equip you with the tools to talk to a human being who is sobbing in your office. because they're experiencing burnout.
No, it doesn't. And that failure in training brings us to the third reason, which is perhaps the most insidious mechanism driving the credibility gap.
Okay, what is it?
The metrics trap.
The metrics trap.
Yes. The incentives within modern corporate organizations actively prioritize raw efficiency over relationship building.
Walk me through that. How do metrics actually destroy empathy?
Let's look at a day in the life of an HR professional. How are their performance reviews graded?
I assume by how much they get done.
Exactly. They're judged on metrics like time to fill an open position, cost per hire, the sheer volume of employee support tickets closed per week, increasing their span of control.
Those are all pure efficiency metrics?
They are.
They sound like manufacturing metrics. Like, it's how you would measure a factory line stamping out car parts, not how you would measure human interaction.
And that is the exact problem. When HR professionals are heavily pressured by senior leadership to process human beings like widgets on an assembly line, empathy is actively disincentivized.
Because empathy takes time.
Empathy is inherently inefficient. Listening to the nuanced, messy details of an employee's conflict takes time. Validating their emotions takes time.
Right.
Individualized attention ruins your time to resolution metrics.
So if an HR representative spends an hour genuinely listening to an employee who is struggling with a toxic manager, validating their concerns, working out a thoughtful solution, they're actually hurting their own career progression.
Yes.
Just because they didn't close enough arbitrary support tickets that afternoon.
That is the tragic reality of the metrics trap. The system punishes the exact behaviors that build relational credibility.
That is so depressing.
The psychological toll this takes on the HR professionals themselves is immense. Many people enter the HR field because they genuinely care about people and want to help them thrive.
Right.
But they find themselves trapped in a system that demands cold, mechanical efficiency, forcing them to suppress their own empathy just to keep their jobs.
If the system explicitly rewards efficiency and technical skills while punching time-consuming empathy, what happens when those people get promoted? You're going to end up with a boardroom full of executives who are essentially human-shaped calculators.
Which leads directly into a fascinating area of the research concerning executive derailment.
Executive derailment.
Yeah. Researchers like Lombardo and Eichinger have spent years studying why top executives, particularly in HR, suddenly fail, lose their effectiveness, or get fired. Why do they derail?
And what do they find?
The findings are startling. When a top HR executive fails, it is almost never a technical incompetence issue.
Right.
They didn't suddenly forget how to read a balance sheet or interpret labor law.
Let me guess. It's the relational side coming back to haunt them.
Yeah. Almost without exception. The primary factors for executive derailment are an abrasive interpersonal style, a fundamental failure to build collaborative relationships, an inability to adapt their communication style to different audiences, and an insensitivity to the concerns of stakeholders.
Wow.
The very technical skills and ruthless efficiency that get you promoted early in your career become the exact relational deficits that get you fired at the senior level.
So if you're an everyday employee listening to this, the irony is just staggering.
It really is.
The very systems, metrics, and technologies that organizations implemented to make HR more strategic and efficient are actively making HR functionally useless to the people they are supposed to serve.
Exactly.
If I'm an employee and I know my HR rep is a stressed-out double agent who's secretly watching the clock because their performance review depends on getting me out of their office in under 10 minutes, I am simply not going to talk to them.
And that withdrawal is exactly where the damage moves from a theoretical frustration into highly measurable, practical organizational destruction.
It's the bottom line.
Big time. When the workforce collectively decides that HR is not safe or useful to talk to, the fallout is severe. We begin to see what is essentially organizational sabotage.
I want to spend some time on this fallout because earlier you mentioned that when relational credibility dies, the company actually starts bleeding money and talent. What does that actually look like on the ground?
The first major visible symptom is reduced utilization.
Meaning people just stop going.
Employees simply stop using HR services, even when there are massive objective benefits to doing so.
Right.
If HR is perceived as dismissive, judgmental, or untrustworthy, people will avoid them at all costs. They stop reporting ethics violations. They stop seeking conflict resolution. They refuse to use employee assistance programs for mental health.
Because the calculation the employee makes is, if I go to HR, they're just going to judge me. Or worse, they'll use what I say against me to protect the company.
Exactly.
I'll just keep my mouth shut. But if nobody is talking, that means minor, highly fixable problems are just left to rot in the dark.
Precisely. Minor interpersonal frictions fester and metastasize into department-wide toxic culture problems.
Yeah.
By the time HR finally catches wind of the issue, it's no longer a conversation. It's a full-blown crisis with people threatening to quit.
Which is way harder to fix.
But the damage scales up significantly when we look at macro-organizational events like massive change initiatives, mergers, acquisitions, organizational restructurings. These are times when HR is usually heavily relied upon to champion the change.
And as a baseline, human beings already deeply resent corporate change.
They do. Change research consistently shows that an employee's receptiveness to a new initiative correlates strongly with their trust in the person delivering the message.
Okay.
The author cites a fascinating study by CEO and Hill examining corporate mergers. They compared successful, profitable mergers against mergers that completely collapsed.
What was the variable? Because if two companies are merging, I would assume the financials or the market overlap would dictate the success.
It wasn't the financials.
Really?
The deciding factor was how the HR leadership handled the psychological element of the human beings involved.
Wow.
In the successful mergers, HR leaders prioritized high interactional justice.
Meaning they treated people well.
Yes, they demonstrated visible empathy for the very real anxiety employees felt about potentially losing their jobs or having their roles altered. They created psychologically safe spaces for people to voice their fears without being labeled as not team players.
That makes a huge difference.
It does. Those specific mergers achieved significantly faster integration timelines, experienced lower voluntary turnover of top talent, and maintained higher productivity throughout the transition.
And the problematic mergers? What do they do differently?
The HR leaders in the failed mergers over-indexed on technical credibility.
Just the numbers.
They emphasized efficiency, compliance, timelines. They focused purely on the paperwork of integrating the two companies and actively minimized the emotional dimensions, treating employee anxiety as a nuisance to be managed rather than a reality to be respected.
But what happened?
The result was a massive talent drain as top performers fled the uncertainty, plummeting productivity, and a total cultural collapse.
It's like trying to blend two completely different families together by only examining their tax returns and completely ignoring the fact that the kids despise each other.
That is a perfect analogy.
You simply cannot spreadsheet your way through human anxiety. But this brings us to an incredibly critical point in the research regarding legal risk. You mentioned litigation earlier.
Yes, the Goldman research.
Are you really saying that an employee's decision to sue a company is driven more by feeling dismissed by an HR rep than by the company actually breaking a labor law?
Yes, and this is a profound insight. It's based on research by Goldman regarding employment discrimination claims and litigation propensity.
Okay.
It loops entirely back to the concept of interactional justice. The research finds that feeling disrespected, feeling dismissed, or feeling stripped of your dignity during a disciplinary or termination process is a far stronger predictor of whether an employee will file a lawsuit than the actual objective legal merits of their case. I am struggling to wrap my head around that. Lawsuits are expensive, they're exhausting, they take years. Surely someone only calls a lawyer if they know for a fact the company violated a specific legal statute and they want a financial payout.
That's the logical assumption, but human behavior in crisis is rarely strictly logical. Let's look at the emotional trigger.
Okay.
If a company completely botches the legal paperwork for terminating someone, maybe they miscalculate the severance slightly, or the documentation is sloppy, but the HR manager sits down with the employee, treats them with immense respect, offers a genuine explanation, validates their contributions, and helps them transition with dignity.
Yeah.
The litigation rates drop substantially. Even if the employee technically has a case, they rarely sue.
Because their dignity was preserved.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But flip the scenario. Imagine a company does everything 100% legally perfect.
Bulletproof. Every single I is jotted, every T is crossed. The documentation is flawless. But the HR representative calls the employee into a glass office, coldly hands them a cardboard box, tells them they have 5 minutes to vacate the premises, and treats them with the suspicion of a common criminal.
That sounds traumatic.
The employee's dignity is completely shattered. They are calling an employment lawyer the second they hit the pavement in the parking lot.
The referee analogy holds up perfectly here. The player doesn't try to get the referee fired because of the literal penalty yardage. They try to get the ref fired because the ref humiliated them on national television.
It's a perfect parallel. Lawsuits are frequently driven by deep anger, a desperate desire for vindication, and a fundamental need to restore stolen dignity.
Wow.
When interactional justice is violated, employees will use the immense blunt force of the legal system to punish the disrespect they experienced.
That is fascinating.
And on an individual level, even if an employee doesn't sue, the psychological toll this takes is devastating. The research introduces the concept of the psychological contract.
Which is what? Exactly. I assume we aren't talking about the actual piece of paper you sign when you get hired.
No, the psychological contract is entirely unwritten. It represents the implicit set of expectations and mutual obligations between an employee and an employer.
Like an unspoken agreement that says, you know, I will give you my best creative effort, I'll answer emails on the weekend, and I will care about this company's success.
Mm-hmm.
And in return, you'll treat me like a valued human being, support my growth, and give me a fair shot at that promotion.
That is exactly it. HR is almost universally viewed by the workforce as the physical embodiment of the organization in maintaining that implicit agreement.
Right.
When HR acts callously or treats an employee in a purely transactional, mechanical way during a highly vulnerable moment like a personal crisis or a severe interpersonal conflict, that psychological contract fractures.
It breaks.
It's not just experienced as a bad meeting, it is experienced by the employee as a profound personal betrayal.
Wow.
It leads to deep cynicism, a withdrawal of discretionary effort, and what popular culture currently calls quiet quitting.
It sounds identical to a marriage vow being broken, even if it wasn't a vow that was written down. The fundamental trust that underpinned the relationship is just gone.
And we have to emphasize a critical, darker reality here. This damage is not distributed equally across the workforce.
What do you mean?
The research specifically highlights the disproportionate impact this lack of relational credibility has on employees from marginalized backgrounds.
How does the impact differ?
For individuals holding minoritized identities, whether related to race, gender, sexual orientation, or disability, the workplace often already involves navigating a gauntlet of heightened scrutiny, systemic barriers, and daily microaggressions.
Right, it's already harder.
This baseline level of stress and vulnerability required simply to exist in the corporate space is already significantly higher.
So they're already carrying a heavier cognitive load just by showing up.
Yes. So when an HR leader interacts with an employee from a marginalized background in a dismissive, culturally insensitive, or purely transactional way, it is not just an unfortunate conversation.
It's much more than that.
It actively compounds those existing microaggressions. It validates the employee's underlying fear that the institution does not actually value them. It reinforces systemic barriers.
Man.
A lack of relational credibility in HR doesn't just hurt feelings. It actively subverts and destroys an organization's diversity, equity, and inclusion objectives, creating significant lasting harm to those individuals.
This entire picture is sounding incredibly bleak for anyone listening who has to navigate corporate life right now.
So it's a lot.
We have an HR system that is trapped by conflicting roles, obsessed with factory line efficiency metrics, bleeding money in failed mergers and unnecessary lawsuits, and actively traumatizing its most vulnerable employees.
Yeah.
That sounds like a completely broken system. So the obvious question is, if this system causes this much measurable damage, how are the best companies actually fixing it? How do we rewire HR to be human again?
The good news is that the research points to very specific, heavily evidence-based responses. And the first critical takeaway for any organization trying to fix this is that mere awareness is entirely insufficient.
You can't just put up a motivational poster about empathy in the break room and expect the culture to shift.
Exactly. You cannot lecture someone into being empathetic. Leaders need rigorous behavioral rehearsal and strict accountability. Organizations have to start treating interactional justice as a nice-to-have personality trait and start cultivating it as a core, measurable competency required to hold the job.
So we have to actually train people how to be interactionally just. What does that training actually look like in practice?
It means breaking down the vague concept of respectful treatment into highly specific, observable behaviors.
Like what?
Things like providing thorough and adequate explanations for decisions, explicitly refraining from improper or biased remarks, actively demonstrating concern for employees' perspective before rendering a judgment, and communicating with genuine candor.
Tangible actions.
Yes. Training programs that target these specific behaviors using intensive role-playing, simulations, and expert peer feedback generate massive, measurable improvements in employee perceptions of fairness.
I am so glad you mentioned role-playing and specific behaviors, because the article details how some major, highly successful companies have implemented this. Let's talk about Microsoft.
Great example.
The source notes they realized this empathy gap was a serious problem and built a program around what they called radical empathy. How did they actually execute that?
Microsoft's approach was brilliant because they understood they were dealing with highly analytical, technically minded people.
Engineers mostly.
Right. They didn't just tell their HR leaders and managers to be nicer. They educated them on the actual neuroscience of empathy.
The Murray science.
Yeah, they explained how the human brain processes perspective taking.
What do you mean by the neuroscience of empathy? How does the brain actually handle that?
It comes down to understanding neural networks. When an HR leader is stressed, maybe they have 10 meetings that day, and metrics to hit their brain defaults to an executive functioning network focus purely on task completion and efficiency.
Just getting things done.
Exactly. Empathy, on the other hand, requires activating different neural pathways, like the anterior insula, which is involved in emotional regulation and understanding another person's feelings.
Oh, wow.
Microsoft taught their leaders that under stress, your brain will naturally shut down empathy to save energy.
Wait, so lack of empathy isn't necessarily malice, it's a biological stress response.
Often, yes. That's crazy. So Microsoft moved from that neurological understanding into highly structured behavioral rehearsal to build neuroplasticity.
How do they do that?
They practiced active listening exercises. They practiced asking open-ended, perspective-seeking questions. They actively role-played how to take an adversarial, tense situation and reframe it into a collaborative problem-solving exercise.
Repetition.
They basically forced their brains to practice the pathways of empathy so it would become the default response even under pressure.
They essentially built a high-intensity interval training gym for empathy and made their leadership work out until the muscle memory was there.
That's exactly what they did.
That is fascinating. What were the results?
The results were highly measurable. Internal evaluation showed a significant drop in employee conflicts escalating to senior leadership and massive sustained improvements in employee satisfaction with their HR interactions.
That is a perfect example of turning a soft skill into a hard discipline. And then there's Pixar Animation Studios, which has a famously unique corporate culture.
Yes.
The source discusses their approach, which they call candor with care.
Pixar's approach is deeply entwined with the concept of psychological safety.
Okay.
They created structured forums, often called brain trusts, where employees could raise intense criticisms about creative projects, internal processes, or even people issues without any fear of retaliation.
Which sounds great on paper.
But the secret to making those forums work was entirely dependent on how HR and leadership were trained to handle the incoming criticism.
Right, because if I step into a forum, offer a critique, and HR or leadership immediately gets defensive or punitive, I'm never speaking up again. The forum becomes a trap.
Exactly. Defensiveness is the death of safety. Yeah.
Pixar meticulously trained their HR leaders to respond to employee criticism with intense curiosity rather than defensiveness.
How do you do that?
When a leader receives criticism, their natural biological instinct is to justify their actions,
Yeah.
defend their policy, or deflect the blame.
Defend yourself.
Right. Pixar trained them to override that instinct. They were taught to pause, explicitly validate the employee's concern, and pivot to collaborative problem solving.
Wow.
This cemented Pixar's culture as an environment where massive creative risks and brutal honesty could flourish, purely because the interpersonal norms surrounding the feedback were so deeply respectful.
You mentioned psychological safety, and the author cites Amy Edmondson's foundational research on this topic. I feel like we need to pause here because psychological safety is a massive buzzword right now.
It's everywhere.
It gets thrown around on every LinkedIn post, but I think a lot of people fundamentally misunderstand what it actually means.
They absolutely do. The common misconception is that psychological safety is about being nice.
People think it describes a fragile workplace where everyone constantly agrees with each other, standards are lowered, and no one is ever allowed to get their feelings hurt.
Which would be terrible for business.
It would, and that is completely incorrect. Edmondson defines psychological safety as the shared belief within a team that you will not be punished, humiliated, or retaliated against for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or for admitting mistakes.
It isn't about avoiding conflict. It's the freedom to engage in candid conflict without fear of reprisal.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And for an HR department, establishing this safety is paramount.
Why?
When employees feel psychologically safe, they report critical errors earlier before they become disasters. They share vital operational information. They seek support for minor conflicts before they escalate into massive lawsuits.
Okay, makes sense.
But to build that safety, HR has to master very specific behaviors. And one of the most critical and frankly counterintuitive behaviors highlighted in the research is something called confidentiality transparency.
Okay, I want to push back on this a bit because this sounds tricky. What does confidentiality transparency actually mean?
It means being radically uncomfortably honest upfront about what you can keep secret and what you cannot.
Give me an example.
A major way HR destroys psychological safety is by overpromising. An employee comes into the office looking nervous. To comfort them, the HR rep immediately says, "Don't worry, close the door. Everything you tell me is strictly confidential."
They say this to get the employee to open up.
Right.
Seems like a natural, empathetic thing to do.
It does, but it's a trap.
Ugh.
The employee then reveals a severe sexual harassment issue involving a senior executive.
Oh, no.
Legally, the HR representative cannot keep that confidential. They're obligated by law and company policy to report it and initiate a formal investigation.
Oh, wow. So HR has to immediately turn around and break the promise they just made.
Yeah,
And suddenly the employee feels completely betrayed and exposed.
exactly. And that betrayal spreads through the organizational grapevine like wildfire. The research shows that being transparent about the hard boundaries of confidentiality actually generates far more durable trust.
So what should they say?
It means saying up front, before the employee even starts talking, "I want to support you, but I need you to know my limits. Here are the types of things I can keep entirely between us, and here are the specific legal or ethical violations that I would be required to escalate."
But wait, if an HR rep tells me right out of the gate that they might have to report what I'm about to say, I'm just going to walk right back out the door. How does that possibly build trust? It sounds like it would shut the conversation down immediately.
It's a concept called bounded trust.
Bounded trust.
Yes, it might make the initial conversation more hesitant, but it establishes you as an honest actor. By setting realistic expectations, you treat the employee like an adult capable of making an informed decision about their own risk.
Okay, I see.
If you lie to them with a blanket promise of secrecy that gets broken, they will never trust you again, and neither will anyone they talk to. Honesty about limits builds more respect than comforting lies.
That makes total sense when you frame it as bounded trust. It's about respecting their agency.
Exactly.
Another critical element the article highlights for building psychological safety is a concept I find really powerful: visible vulnerability. The idea that HR leaders actively need to admit their own mistakes out loud.
Yes. In traditional corporate culture, leadership is taught to project infallibility.
Never show weakness.
Right. But when an HR leader publicly acknowledges their own limitations or admits they mishandled a situation, it does not diminish their authority. It drastically humanizes them.
It makes them relatable.
It signals to the entire organization that it is acceptable to be a work in progress and that mistakes are learning opportunities rather than fireable offenses. It makes their relational credibility skyrocket.
If the person in charge of enforcing the rules is willing to stand up and say, "Hey, I messed up that difficult conversation yesterday. I was rushing, I wasn't listening closely enough to your concerns, and I genuinely apologize," that completely shatters the image of the corporate robot.
It does.
It proves there's a flawed, honest human being in the chair. But this brings up a really tough practical question.
Go on.
It's one thing to be visibly vulnerable and practice radical empathy when you're facilitating a brainstorming session or talking about career development or designing a wellness program. Those are easy moments to be empathetic.
True.
How does psychological safety hold up when things go terribly fundamentally wrong? How do you apply these warm concepts to the absolute coldest, hardest parts of HR, laying people off, firing them for cause, or investigating them?
That is the ultimate, undeniable stress test for HR credibility.
Yeah.
The author emphasizes that true relational credibility is not forged during the easy times. It is forged in these exact high-stakes moments where organizational interests and individual livelihoods violently collide.
It's the crucible.
Terminations, massive layoffs, and disciplinary actions are where credibility is either cemented or destroyed forever.
Because in those specific moments, HR is wielding a tremendous, almost terrifying amount of power over someone's life, their ability to pay rent, and their identity.
Yes, and the research is definitive on this. Empathy must be embedded into the very protocols of these dignity-centered moments.
Huh.
We talked earlier about how respectful treatment during a firing drastically reduces the likelihood of litigation,
Right.
but it also drastically reduces the lasting psychological trauma inflicted on the departing employee. Crucially, it also protects the commitment and morale of the survivor
The
employees.
survivor employees, you mean the people who didn't get laid off?
Exactly. The people left behind are watching closely. They watch how their colleague was treated on their way out the door, and they internalize that observation as a direct indicator of what the company actually thinks of them.
Oh, wow.
If you treat the departing employee like garbage, the survivors assume they are next and their trust evaporates.
So how do you actually fire or lay someone off with empathy? It sounds almost impossible to do well. Are there companies that have actually executed this at scale?
The author provides a phenomenal, highly detailed case study from Starbucks during their massive 2008 restructuring.
2008, so right in the financial crisis.
Yes, the context here is critical. It was the height of the global financial crisis. Starbucks was facing existential operational challenges and had to conduct significant, painful workforce reductions.
People were panicking everywhere.
The standard ruthless corporate playbook during a crisis like that would dictate rapid, cold layoffs, escort people out of the building on a Friday afternoon, cut their email access immediately to minimize security risks, and say as little as possible to avoid lawsuits.
The classic traumatizing cardboard box walk of shame.
Exactly. But Starbucks took a radically different, highly intentional approach. They systematically embedded dignity into the entire process.
What did they do?
They provided advance notice to employees whenever it was legally and operationally possible. They offered highly transparent, detailed communication about the business rationale driving the layoff.
So they didn't just give some corporate PR spin.
No, they treated the employees like intelligent adults who could understand the grim macroeconomic realities, rather than hiding behind vague corporate speak.
They respected them enough to tell them the truth about the money.
Yes. And they backed it up structurally. They provided unusually generous severance packages, continued health benefits during a terrifying economic period, and heavily partnered with outplacement services to actively help the departing people find new jobs.
That's huge.
They treated them like valued alumni of the company, not as sudden liabilities to be discarded.
That is remarkable. And what about the survivor employees we talked about? How did Starbucks handle them?
They didn't stop with the departing staff. For the remaining employees, senior executives held extensive, emotionally honest town halls where they candidly discussed how agonizing the decisions were.
Visible vulnerability.
Exactly. They allowed themselves to be visibly vulnerable about the pain of the process.
And what was the result?
The result of all this interactional justice. Starbucks preserved employee trust so effectively during an existential crisis that when economic conditions eventually improved years later, many of those exact laid-off workers happily returned to work for Starbucks.
That is absolutely incredible. They laid people off in a way that preserved so much dignity that the employees wanted to come back.
It's unheard of.
That is the ultimate, undeniable return on investment for interactional justice. But it takes an immense amount of self-awareness and emotional control to execute that. Which brings us to one of the most fascinating psychological elements in this entire deep dive.
The science of power.
Yes, the research by psychologists Keltner and Galinsky on how power actually works.
This is a crucial piece of the puzzle that explains why this is all so difficult. We have to acknowledge that HR roles inherently carry substantial positional and organizational power.
Oh, absolutely.
They influence hiring, they influence paychecks, career progression, terminations. And psychological research on how power affects the human brain reveals a very dangerous biological dynamic.
Which is?
Possessing positional authority actually distorts a person's neurological ability to take another person's perspective.
Wait, let me make sure I'm hearing this right. Are you saying that having power physically changes how your brain views other people?
It actively alters your cognitive processing.
That's terrifying.
The research by Keltner and Galinsky demonstrates that power holders consistently overestimate their own levels of empathy while vastly underestimating their negative impact on less powerful people.
Wow.
Having power reduces your perspective-taking accuracy. It increases your cognitive reliance on stereotyping because your brain doesn't feel the need to process nuanced information about people below you.
It's just a shortcut.
Exactly. It quite literally decreases your brain's attention to the individual traits of your subordinates.
This raises a wild, deeply validating point for you listening right now. If you've ever been in a meeting with your boss, or an HR director, or a CEO, and you felt like they just completely didn't get it, like they were totally oblivious to how their brilliant new policies were destroying your life on the ground. Science literally backs you up.
It really does.
The positional power they hold over your paycheck is actively altering their brain's ability to empathize with your reality unless they're consciously, deliberately fighting that biological distortion.
It creates a massive structural blind spot in leadership. An HR leader with high positional authority might design a strict return to office mandate. Because they have power, money, and autonomy, they think, this is perfectly reasonable, I'm a very empathetic leader, I'm doing this for the culture.
Right.
They completely fail to realize how their authority blinds them to the childcare panic, the commuting costs, or the financial strain the mandate causes frontline employees. Their power prevents them from seeing the friction.
So how on earth do you fight that? If holding power inherently corrupts your empathy on a neurological level, what is the antidote? Can you fix it?
The antidote is implementing structured, deliberate mechanisms designed specifically to force perspective taking and circumvent the natural hierarchy.
Good.
You can't rely on a leader just trying to be nicer. You need a system that checks their power.
Does the author give an example?
The author highlights how the outdoor apparel company Patagonia combats this specific power distortion. They use a mechanism called listening circles.
How do listening circles actually operate to counter the power imbalance?
These are regular, highly structured sessions where HR leaders and executives actively solicit anonymous, unvarnished feedback from frontline employees about HR processes, policies, and their own leadership effectiveness.
Sounds intense.
But the true genius of the system is what happens before the circle even begins. The HR leaders receive intensive coaching beforehand on how to psychologically receive this specific feedback.
Why do they need coaching for that?
They are trained to recognize their own defensive physiological reactions, the spike in heart rate, the immediate urge to interrupt, the desire to justify their policy, or the reflex to explain away the criticism.
They have to be trained to fight their own biological power reflex.
Exactly. They are instructed to respond purely with curiosity, asking clarifying questions only without defending themselves.
That's got to be hard.
By forcing this dynamic, Patagonia's HR function surfaced vital, uncomfortable insights about how their authority was inadvertently intimidating people. They learned that processes that felt perfectly efficient and logical to HR were actually deeply burdensome, bureaucratic, and disrespectful to the everyday employees.
So the listening circles actively puncture the bubble of positional authority.
Precisely.
I love that concept.
Yeah.
Recognizing that power dynamics exist naturally leads to recognizing other complex dynamics in the workplace. We aren't all the same.
Oh.
We come from different racial backgrounds, different cultures, different socioeconomic realities, and different lived experiences. And navigating the friction between those differences is a massive part of modern HR's job.
Huge part.
Which brings us to a fascinating distinction the research makes. The shift from cultural competence to cultural humility. I hear the phrase cultural competence all the time in corporate diversity training. Why is the author arguing that it is an outdated concept?
The source makes a deeply critical distinction here, drawing heavily on research by scholars Tervalon and Murray Garcia. Cultural competence is the older, more traditional model.
Okay.
It suggests that if you take enough online courses, read enough books, and memorize enough demographic facts about a specific marginalized group or culture, you can eventually become competent in interacting with them.
It treats diversity like a syllabus or a checklist. Like, I read a 20-page pamphlet on this demographic, I took a multiple-choice quiz, therefore I am now certified to manage them perfectly and without bias.
Exactly. It implies a fixed endpoint. It suggests a level of mastery that you can achieve and then stop learning.
Which is impossible.
Right. And dangerously, it often leads to harmful stereotyping because it assumes everyone within a specific cultural or racial group acts the exact same way or holds the same values.
So what's the alternative?
Cultural humility is a completely different paradigm. It is not an endpoint. It is a lifelong, ongoing practice. It is the active recognition of the profound limits of your own cultural knowledge.
It's an admission that you do not and cannot know everything about someone else's lived experience.
Right. Cultural humility requires maintaining a posture of genuine, relentless curiosity about another person's specific individual experience.
Yeah.
It requires maintaining an openness to learning, even when you think you are an expert. And perhaps most importantly and most uncomfortably, it requires deep, ongoing self-reflection on your own implicit biases and the systemic power imbalances at play in your interactions.
So it's not about them. It's about you.
Under the humility model, you aren't studying them to master them. You are rigorously studying yourself to understand how your own cultural lens and privilege affects your interactions.
Connecting this back to the listener's daily life,
Mm.
think about how much more respected you feel when a manager or an HR rep sits down with you and says, I don't completely understand your experience with this issue, but I really want to learn. Can you help me understand?
Yes.
Contrast that with someone who sits down and acts like they already know everything about your background and your struggles because they attended a diversity seminar 3 years ago.
It's night and day.
The humility builds incredible relational trust, whereas the false competence builds a wall.
It absolutely does. And on an organizational level, cultural humility requires what the author calls systemic equity analysis.
What's that?
It means moving beyond just being polite in interpersonal interactions and looking hard at the corporate structures themselves.
The policies.
Exactly. HR has to examine how seemingly neutral, objective policies, like how performance reviews are scored, what criteria are used for promotions, or even dress code policies, might actually systematically advantage certain groups while systematically disadvantaging others.
I want to ground that in reality. How does a company actually apply systemic equity analysis using cultural humility?
The Cleveland Clinic provides a brilliant case study detailed in the text.
Okay, let's hear it.
As a massive healthcare organization, their HR department didn't just run standard off-the-shelf diversity training. They implemented deep cultural humility training that specifically examined well-documented healthcare disparities.
Like what kind of disparities?
For example, the massive disparities in maternal mortality rates or how pain management is historically biased against minority patients. And they looked at the parallels within their own corporate hierarchy.
Wow.
HR leaders were required to engage in structured reflection about their own privilege and biases.
So they didn't just look outward at patient data. They looked in the mirror first to see how those same biases might be affecting their hiring and promotion data.
Exactly. They engaged in community immersion, and they fundamentally partnered with employee resource groups, which are cultural affinity organizations within the company, to identify which specific internal policies needed to change.
They asked for help?
They didn't assume they knew the answers from the top down. They humbly asked the groups who were directly affected by the policies.
And did it work?
The result of pairing humility with structural action was a highly significant improvement in the retention of employees from underrepresented backgrounds and major recognition as a genuine diversity leader in their field.
So they paired the humility to genuinely listen with a positional authority to actually change the systemic policies that were causing harm. That is incredibly powerful.
It's the gold standard.
All right, we have covered an immense amount of ground here today. We've dissected the 3 types of organizational justice. We've looked at the systemic traps of factory-line corporate metrics. We explored the literal brain-altering effects of positional power, and we examined the absolute necessity of cultural humility over mere competence.
We really have covered a lot.
So as we look to wrap this all up, how do we make this last? How does an HR professional, or frankly, any manager listening to this, who leads people survive long-term without burning out, losing their empathy, or losing their credibility?
The first, most critical step to sustainability is ending the charade.
The charade.
The author emphasizes that HR must fundamentally recalibrate the psychological contract we discussed earlier by being radically, perhaps uncomfortably honest about their dual loyalties.
Ah, right.
HR professionals often burn out rapidly because they desperately want to be the employee's therapist, advocate, and best friend. But the corporate structure simply will not allow it.
Right, because eventually the mandate comes down from the CEO, and they have to put the company's financial or legal interests first. And if they pretended to be your best friend, that pivot feels like a knife in the back.
Exactly. Sustainable leadership requires transparently acknowledging that tension up front before a crisis ever occurs.
Setting boundaries.
HR isn't your therapist. They are employed by the organization. But, and this is the crucial defining distinction, that they can completely fulfill their organizational mandate to protect the company while still treating you with the utmost human dignity.
It's not mutually exclusive.
Right. By explicitly communicating those realistic boundaries, they stop overpromising. They explain their decision-making criteria clearly. This honesty prevents the feelings of deep betrayal when tough, unavoidable organizational calls have to be made.
I work for the company, but I will always treat you with respect, and I won't lie to you about my constraints. It sets a realistic expectation that allows for bounded trust.
Exactly.
What else is needed for sustainability? Because one person can't carry all this empathy alone.
You are exactly right. They can't, which is why the author points to the concept of distributed relational leadership.
Distributed relational leadership.
Relational credibility absolutely cannot rely on just one charismatic, highly empathetic HR superstar in the department. If that one person burns out or leaves for another job, the entire culture of trust collapses overnight.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Empathy and interactional justice have to be built into the team fabric.
How do you build it into the fabric of a whole department?
Through rigorous peer accountability and continuous learning loops, HR teams need to normalize real-time peer-to-peer feedback on interpersonal effectiveness.
Okay.
It needs to be culturally safe for one HR representative to say to another after a meeting, "Hey, I noticed in there you made some quick assumptions without checking, and you really shut that employee down and they were trying to explain their side."
Calling each other out, but politely.
Exactly. They need mentorship structures that explicitly focus on relational development and emotional regulation, not just technical skills. And finally, they have to measure their collective capability through aggregate employee experience data, holding the entire team accountable for the relational climate.
So bringing everything we've talked about together, what is the ultimate takeaway for the listener today? Whether they work in HR trying to improve their practice, whether they're a manager leading a small team,
Mm.
or whether they're just trying to survive the corporate landscape and finally understand why their workplace feels the way it does.
The ultimate summary is that the era of relying solely on your resume, your certifications, and your technical chops is definitively over.
It's done.
Technical mastery merely earns you a seat at the table. It gets you the interview. But how you treat people, your mastery of interactional justice, your ability to cultivate genuine psychological safety, and your dedication to cultural humility that determines if anyone actually wants to listen to you once you are sitting there.
Yeah.
The relational foundation is what makes the technical expertise functional. Without empathy, without the ability to connect with the human beings in your organization, all the technical experience in the world is essentially useless in a leadership capacity.
It really is a massive paradigm shift in how we value skills.
Yeah.
We've taken quite a journey today.
We really have.
We started by understanding why that perfectly legal, technically flawless HR interaction still left you feeling awful in the parking lot. We dug deep into the metrics trap that forces HR to act like assembly line workers rather than human advocates. We looked at the terrifying reality of how positional power physically alters our brain's ability to empathize.
The neuroscience is wild.
And we've seen how visionary companies like Microsoft, Pixar, and Starbucks are actively, systematically rewiring their cultures to prioritize human dignity over cold efficiency.
And it all points back to one undeniable fact. Humans are deeply complex relational beings. We do not just want fairness in our outcomes. We demand fairness and dignity in our treatment.
Absolutely. And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over, building on a brief mention the author makes about AI integration in HR. And we talked a lot today about how the HR profession has become obsessed with data analytics, software systems, and artificial intelligence, sometimes completely to the detriment of human empathy. But I want you to think about the long game here. As AI models get exponentially better at ensuring legal compliance, writing flawless policies, navigating the nuances of employment law, and running complex compensation analytics, those hard technical skills that everyone is so proud of are eventually going to be entirely automated.
The algorithms will do the technical, bureaucratic work infinitely better, faster, and cheaper than any human being ever could.
Exactly. So what is left for the human professional? Empathy. Psychological safety, the ability to look a fellow human being in the eye, navigate a messy, highly emotional conflict, and treat them with profound dignity during their absolute worst, most vulnerable moments.
It's the only thing left.
That is the one thing an algorithm simply cannot do. If your technical skills got you the job yesterday, your relational empathy might be your only true job security tomorrow. Because at the end of the day, nobody wants to be fired, managed, or comforted by a highly trained robot. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Next time you step into a meeting with HR or any leadership, we hope you can view the interaction through this powerful new lens of interactional justice. Until next time.